So, for this project, I decided to talk about Moses, and I named him the Trailblazer into the Desert. So, a little bit of background: Moses was born to an Israelite family who was enslaved by the Egyptians. So, at this time, all the Israelites were held captive in Egypt and they were treated as slaves. As they increased in number, however, the Egyptian Pharaoh became threatened and ordered every newborn Hebrew boy to be killed. So, as the population of the Israelites grew, Pharaoh grew very antsy and threatened that they might join forces with other enemies of Egypt and overthrow Egypt. And so, because of this, he made this law that every newborn boy would be killed in order to keep the population in check. So Moses' mother hid him in a basket and sent him floating down the Nile River. This is a pretty risky move to do for a mother. You don't know what's going to happen to him, but in a matter where it was seriously life and death, this was probably her only option that she had. And by the grace of God, Moses in this little basket floated right to where Pharaoh's daughter was. And with Pharaoh's permission, his daughter kept Moses as her own. So Moses' story, he grew up in the royal house, obviously. He was treated like a son and a grandson to Pharaoh. But once Moses reached adulthood, he found an Egyptian beating and torturing this Israelite as he was working. And because of that, Moses killed the Egyptian. And so the penalty or the punishment for killing an Egyptian was the death penalty. So because of this, Moses fled Egypt and he escaped to Midian. And he lived in Midian for 40 years. This is where he found his wife. This is where he made a home. He worked and started a family. And so as Moses was going along, he probably never thought he'd ever return to Egypt. But he was in Midian and he comes across this bush that is burning, and it's just this single bush on Mount Horeb, and it's quite a sight, I can imagine. And he goes to this bush, and the Lord tells him to remove his sandals because he is on holy ground. And it is here, through this burning bush, that the Lord tells Moses that he needs to go back to Egypt in order to free his people. And so God had not forgot the Israelites at this time. They were still in Egypt and they were still suffering. And Moses, who had escaped, was told to go back, even though he faced the death penalty. And so, with much opposition, Moses went back to Egypt and he faced even more opposition against Pharaoh. But God sent the 10 plagues, and that completely just destroyed Egypt. It killed so many people. But because of those 10 plagues, Pharaoh finally let the Israelites free. However, when the Israelites got to the Egyptian border, God hardened Pharaoh's heart once again, and Pharaoh commanded his army to chase after them. And so this is where we see the Red Sea crossing. The Lord opened up the Red Sea and made dry ground for the Israelites to cross safely. And once the Pharaoh's army gets there, and everyone passes, the Israelites pass through the Red Sea, God makes the waters come together again, and Pharaoh's army is completely destroyed. And so once safely in the desert, God led the Israelites to Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and he receives the 10 Commandments and these laws from the Lord, and comes back down, and the people are worshiping idols. And anyway, this whole journey in the desert is a lot of disloyalty from the Israelites and a lot of faithfulness from God. And so there's a lot of situations that happen, and circumstances change, and it takes 40 years for them to get to the promised land. But Moses leads them to the promised land. They get there, and the Lord is faithful in his promise to them. So the most decisive moment, I feel like, in Moses' life was when he finally obeyed God to go back to Egypt. Although he faced the death penalty, he went back to Egypt and he set his people free from the bondage they had been in. Moses came up with excuses. He admitted to not being an eloquent speaker, and because of that, he disqualified himself for being able to do the job. But with the Lord's help, Moses did go back and he freed his people out of slavery and sent them onward towards the fulfillment of God's promise to take them to their promised land. So, what we can see out of this and how we can apply this to our lives is God has called each and every one of us to a higher calling than anything we can imagine for ourselves. And those things can be very scary, they're daunting, they seem impossible. They're overwhelming, and we can come up with every excuse in the book so that we can't do it. But God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. And so, because because the Lord has commanded us to do these things for Him, we can do it. With Him on our side, nothing can come against us. And we never know what's on the other side of our obedience. We can change the world, lives, nations, history with a simple yes.